Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any time, and we'll address as many as we can after the interview. Let's get started. Good morning. My name is Jay Sapsford, Senior Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Washington. We are delighted you could join us for The Call, a new forum brought to you by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. The Call is designed for you, our members, to navigate some of the toughest geopolitical issues of the day. And here is the question of the moment. What's driving the buzz behind the word fragmentation? This week, the IMF and the World Bank will hold their plenary in Washington on the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Agreement that created the two institutions. The meeting comes after the IMF has been warning of what it sees as a worrisome trend. Business decisions are increasingly driven by geopolitics rather than economics. The result is a fragmentation of trade and investment, with countries favoring allies over economic partners. When they do, the IMF says costs tend to go up and it hurts poor countries the most. An IMF study divided the world into two groups after the start of the Ukraine war. One group, led by the US, voted to condemn Russia's attack. Another either voted against the rebuke or abstained. As global growth and trade slowed after the war, the IMF found that trade between the two camps slowed more than trade within the two groups. That was because $180 billion in investment flows was diverted to the US-led countries condemning Russia. Some see fragmentation as a fancy word for diversification. Others see it as more doomsaying over the fears of deglobalization when, in fact, trade continues to grow. With me now is a guest that has just published an interesting take on this with a column in Barron's arguing that the US, the world's biggest geopolitical player, has an interest in assuring that fragmentation doesn't go too far. Ed Price is a former British trade official, a senior fellow at the NYU Center for Global Affairs, and a frequent contributor to Barron's, the Financial Times, and other publications. Ed, welcome to The Call.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you for having me.
Ed, we've read your piece in Barron's late last week and found your argument fascinating. The U.S. seems to be driving some of the fragmentation in global trade and investment, but you see the dollar as keeping the trend from getting out of hand. Can you please explain?
Sure thing, Jay. And again, thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor. What we've seen since 2016 is the slow progression of variously trade wars, fragmentation, and deglobalization. These are the buzzwords. And what the article tried to argue is, well, look, if you look forwards into the future, there's a hard limit on how far this trend can go. And that limit is the dollar. The dollar is not something that you can mess around with around the edges. If you introduce capital controls, if you introduce sanctions on, for example, Chinese banks, you're probably going to see negative feedback in the dollar standard, in the international currency system as it stands.
I see. Well, so is fragmentation then just another way to say diversification or onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring? Aren't these all one way or another way of just managing risk?
I mean, there could be, Jay. And I think that it's important that while we listen to these buzzwords, we also probe them, question them, and push back a little bit. And if you take a step back and look, for example, at what the IMF is saying about fragmentation, empirically, sure, what you've discussed in the introduction is correct. That is the lay of the land with regard to trade trends. But remember, geopolitical risk is coming out of a very low baseline. And as you also said, trade is still quintessential to the international economy. So, for example, if you imagine, the conceptual realm, what are we actually thinking about when we talk about trade? We've designed this equation, this post-war equation, in which specialization equals trade, equals growth, equals economies of scale, and that's good. And unfortunately, what that equation does is it forgets voting, right? And it forgets the fact that when specialization really takes hold in an economy, voters notice. So to finish that point, there are two great minds in the last 15 years who have noticed this. One is Ben Bernanke, former Federal Reserve Chairman, who talked about the international capital glut and Asian savings glut. And the other, of course, is President Donald Trump, who noticed it on the political side and said so.
Okay, if you've just joined us this morning, this is The Call, a regular video conversation in which we address the geopolitical issues of our time. Today, we are discussing fragmentation of investment flows. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. Okay, so I'm wondering what the agency of businesses are in this. Aren't businesses, rather than governments, driving some of the shift in trade and investment flows? And don't businesses have an interest in shifting trade flows to manage risk?
Well, absolutely they do, and that's their prerogative. And the mandate of business in our political economy is profit, because profit should lead into all sorts of other good things, right? Economic growth is our business. But I think that when you get back to this idea of like, what is business supposed to do? Business is also supposed to comply with the law and read the runes with regard to what we're calling geopolitical risk. This is very difficult for business. And I can share an anecdote. When I was in a former life, when I was a trade official during the Brexit years, every single time that the UK government would say, "Well, look, this is what we want in our negotiation," and the Europeans would say no, what you would see in businesses and on Wall Street and in the financial sector is overcompliance. Businesses would feel nervous in this uncertain environment and decide, well, look, if the politicians can't sort this thing out, we're going to overcomply. We're going to move more business to Europe than we think we should, in anticipation of future rules or regulations coming down the pipe. So yes, absolutely, Jay. The prerogative of business, if not the duty, is to protect itself against volatility. But on the other side, it shouldn't over-imagine or catastrophize.
I see. Well, speaking of catastrophizing, the IMF has warned that fragmenting in the worst case scenario is going to hurt growth by as much as 7% of global GDP. And I'm just wondering, that they provided a range, and this is the far end of that range. But I just wonder if you think that those concerns are a bit overblown.
I mean, 7% would be two G7 economies. I think that's probably a bit overblown. I think the more probable scenario is the 2% loss if China and the US create these two competing blocks. But again, Jay, that's quite linear, because if China and the US do create these two competing blocks, it might be that the supply side changes in both. It might be that there are new avenues of growth. We see innovation in developed economies. And so, again, we're moving away from a very low baseline of geopolitical risk and a very high baseline of international trade integration. And it might be that there is another new equation somewhere that says, look, let's shave a little bit off international GDP in exchange for less volatility, perhaps supply chain derived volatility, because that will smooth growth out over, say, decades.
All right. Well, now I just wonder. The U.S. has its share of national security concerns. If we had the China shock that of a few years back, I'm wondering, doesn't the U.S. have an interest in restricting some trading relationships in its own national interest?
It probably does, and far be it from me to say that when State Department and Treasury decide that there's a naughty list and some people should be on it, far be it from me to say that's wrong. I mean, that is the prerogative of any sovereign country. But by the way, it's something that we've been doing subtly anyway. And I'll give you the example of the European Union. The European Union is in some ways a phenomenon of globalization, because you have this huge trading bloc that previously didn't exist. But in other ways, it's a sort of technology against globalization, right? The Europeans have all these hardwired small p protectionist practices. They have regulatory barriers and so on. So it's not like countries, as they globalize, haven't also decided with whom they will trade in which segments of their economy. I suppose what I'm saying is that there are stages. Like stage one, Donald Trump, let's import fewer goods from China. Fine. Stage two, technology restrictions under Biden and domestic industrial policy. Okay, fine. But if you start going into sanctions and if you start getting into formal capital controls, that is against the US interest.
Okay, that's interesting, because the United States has its narrow interest as a trading player within the geopolitical system, but it's also kind of the playing field itself, because the dollar provides the standard by which everyone else plays. And I'm wondering, the U.S. has used the dollar to sanction Russia. We note that the BRICS group of nations is going to be meeting this week in Russia. It's kind of a counterweight to what's going on here in Washington. How effective has that been, and what are the limits to the U.S. using the dollar as a punitive weapon?
Ineffective, Jay, as measured by the fact that the war in Ukraine is ongoing. I think if you really wanted to stop the Russian attack, you would do two things. You'd allow long-range strikes in Russian territory. I've made that argument again and again. And you would also probably get the Saudis to pump oil yourself and try and crash global oil prices. Not something we're going to do in an inflationary or post-inflationary environment. But I mean, look, the Russia sanctions, I don't think have been effective, because if you really wanted to sanction the Russian financial system, export deflationary pressure, export perhaps a liquidity crisis of some kind, two things again would happen. One, you'd be permanently kicking the Russians off the dollar standard unless you were looking for regime change and wanted to bring them back into the international system after some kind of conflict. But two, let's not forget that, again, international finance is fungible. International capital is fungible with domestic economies. This is one of the big encumbrances of trying to get any economic policy working, because your internal equilibrium is always exposed to external disequilibria. That means that the Chinese finance the Russians, and if we really wanted to hit Russia on the head with financial sanctions, dollar sanctions, we'd probably also have to go after the Chinese, and that would have a domino effect that we just don't understand.
Okay, we've got some questions coming in from our viewership here. I'm wondering, how might the ongoing diversification, one of our audience members asks, the diversification of foreign reserves, particularly toward gold, influence global financial stability?
Global financial stability is underpinned by dollar liquidity, and the dollar is a fiat currency. So I don't think that if the Chinese are stockpiling gold as they are, and if other countries are trying to diversify away from the dollar, that's an immediate market liquidity or dollar liquidity issue. Again, let's remember, Jay, we were speaking about this yesterday, that the dollar has this role as a reserve currency, which everyone knows about and remembers. There's also an exchange or commodities role, right, for the dollar. And if you look at the IMF's figures that are just published, the exchange role is completely sacrosanct. People are using dollars. So it's a more complicated picture than simply saying some third party can diversify away from the dollar and therefore cause financial instability. I don't think that's how it works. I think a bigger long run danger is an oversupply of dollars.
Okay, here's another question from a reader. Are there actions U.S. businesses can take or different strategies to consider to navigate global fragmentation in the short term?
Well, they can dial into calls like this, right? You have to keep your eyes on geopolitical risk now. I would bear in the back of your mind somewhere that, of course, people like me, we benefit in some ways from geopolitical issues because we can go on TV, we can go on calls like this, always take it with a pinch of salt. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to counsel now with the IMF paper and with other narratives of deglobalization and fragmentation. It almost assumes that markets and market forces are a sub-function of economic policy. They're not. And since the 1970s, when we unleashed the aforementioned fiat dollar, one way of describing post-1970s globalization is that market forces in some ways are now the independent variable. So let's not forget the governments don't fully control international commerce anyway.
Right. Okay, we hear a lot about the benefits to the U.S. of the dollar being a global reserve currency. They can borrow more than other countries might be able to under similar circumstances. What are the risks to the U.S. of its dollar being the global default currency?
Donald Trump is the risk. Donald Trump is the ultimate outcome of using a national currency as an international currency. There's an economist, Triffin, who was Belgium, he's writing in the 50s and 60s, who pointed this out. John Maynard Keynes pointed this out. There is essentially a dilemma. If you use a national currency as an international currency, eventually you have to choose between supplying enough of that currency for the global demand versus cutting global demand out because it's inflationary ultimately versus the size of your domestic economy. The fact that the United States has specialized as the world's capital supply side, and the fact that China crudely has specialized as the world's goods supply side, and that we've assumed trade between these two with no political function, is a function of the dollar and ultimately leads to the risk of domestic unhappiness and a political reaction function in the US that pushes back on trade.
I see. Now, I'll note that we here at the Chamber don't take sides in the presidential race going on right now, but we do note that both candidates have proposed plans that would increase the national debt, which is now at $35 trillion. How do you see the growth in U.S. debt influencing the forces reshaping global trade?
Well, if only it did. I suppose I can say something bipartisan. Both candidates are completely useless on this score. If you were looking for a fiscally responsible president, forget it. The long run, the long run trend of U.S. debt is astonishing. And at some point, there's going to be a market reaction. There's going to be an event that markets effectively warn the U.S. through. and say, look, you're reaching this natural level of debt. The natural level of debt that the US can take on is probably pretty high. We have incredible fundamentals. We have an innovative economy, rule of law, all the rest of it. But it's also masked by the role of the dollar as an international reserve currency. So international demand for dollars always outstrips supply until it doesn't. And so I really wish that one of the candidates or both of the candidates would be a bit more serious about spending.
Okay, another question from one of our audience members. Do you see realistic pathways for mutual trust between leading countries to increase in the coming years?
No. If the leading countries in question are Russia, China, the US, and the EU, which is not a country but kind of is, no, I don't. But again, we're going from a very, very high baseline of trust, right? And there have been hundreds of years in which competing blocs, competing countries have some level of trust, but not full levels of trust. And so I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's either that we trust the Chinese fully or we completely don't. There are many things that we should be working with the Chinese on. Global growth is one of them. Climate change is another, of course. It's just that we've just been through this reaction function domestically in which specialization has been noted for its downsides by the voting class, as opposed to simply economies of scale being noted for their upside.
I see. All right, well, one final question. Over the long term, how do you see the redirection of trade and investment along geopolitical lines impacting global economic integration?
So look, again, global economic integration can take two forms, right? We could have carried on trending towards this great globalized vision in which effectively you end up with the global economic government, right? Not necessarily political government, but global economic government. The other way of doing it is to say, look, domestic economies don't want to specialize to the point of being exposed negatively to supply chain shocks. We are going to onshore, reshore, friendshore with perhaps Mexico, but then trade with these other competing blocs. The IMF paper, again, I mentioned it again, was very good on what it calls connector countries. Two examples, Mexico and Vietnam. These countries sit between these two competing blocs and trade as a sort of third party between China and between the US. So again, I don't think it's binary. I do think that the United States and China have core interests entangled with each other through the vector of the dollar, as I argue, and that probably puts a hard cap on the degree to which we can ignore each other.
I see. Well, it seems that to some extent our fate is in the hands of these geopolitical swing states, as you described, or connector states, as you did. I think we're going to have to leave it there as it's time for our audience to get on with their day. Let me thank Ed Price, who teaches at NYU Center for Global Affairs. Ed, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
If you'd like to reach out to our guest, please find the contact under the resource bar at the bottom of your screen. And finally, a warm welcome to you, our members, for joining us today. If you have a theme you would like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us at the email on the screen, globalintel@uschamber.com. We are planning many shows in the coming weeks and months, including one on Thursday, in which we will ask what Russia hopes to get out of the BRICS conference being hosted by Moscow this week. We welcome your suggestions and we welcome your feedback. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.